Hello everyone and welcome to the latest with Amanda.ie. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Amanda Ferguson, a North Belfast woman, journalist, broadcaster, commentator and writer. Welcome to my media representation interview series, exploring the media landscape, the role of women in the media, marginalised voices and more. And I am joined today at Accidental Theatre's Belfast studio by four women who I respect and admire very much. It's the best place to start in this series with women who have seen and done it all. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to my guest. First of all is Susan McKay. Susan is an award-winning author, journalist and commentator from Derry. Her book, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground, has been one of the best-selling books and most talked about books of the summer, so I advise you all to read that. Susan writes for the New York Times, for the Irish Times, for a range of different titles. Before becoming a writer, she was a feminist activist, still is a feminist activist, one of the founders in the early 1980s of the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre and a youth and community worker. She's a former CEO of the National Women's Council of Ireland, and her other books include Bear in Mind These Dead, after the aftermath of the Northern Ireland conflict, and also Sophia's Story, which is the biography of a survivor of child abuse. Next, I am joined by HAILES, who is a freelance journalist from Belfast and has worked in the media all of her life, broadcasting with BBC Radio, the World Service and Ulster Television. She also writes for newspapers and magazines across these islands and has had a hugely varied career: production assistant, PR, theatre productions, TV programmes, national and international documentaries, currently a features writer with the Irish News, also responsible for theatre reviews. I have many pre-COVID memories of meeting Anne at our theatres in Belfast. Also an author. Her book Standby Studio is a look at Belfast and Northern Ireland in the 1960s and the birth of UTV. She also wrote Turn on the Light Mummy, I Can't Hear You, which is a history of the deaf community in Ireland, and received an MBE for services to journalism, broadcasting and service to the public in Northern Ireland. And in her spare time, she advises me that she paints stones, and I'm lucky enough to have received one of these as a gift today. It's a lovely little love bug, so I will treasure this, and it's at the front as our little mascot for today's discussion. Next, I'm joined by Fionnuala O'Connor, who was brought up in every northern county except for Fermanagh. She's another woman on the lineup who's been hugely supportive of my career and another feminist to her core. She has worked as a journalist since 1973, at first from Dublin and then within months from Belfast for the Irish Times. Since 1986, she has been a freelance writer, columnist and commentator and broadcaster, and I love her, she's brilliant. Last but no means least, we have Mary Kelly on our lineup. Mary is from Belfast. She's a columnist for the Irish News after retiring from a 25-year career at the BBC. For much of that time at the BBC, Mary was the producer of the weekly political programme Hearts and Minds, which ended in 2012 and is very much missed, I think, to this day. She was later a producer on Good Morning Ulster and Evening Extra. She started in journalism on the East Antrim Times in Carrickfergus in 1976. Then 2 years later took a break to go to university to study English and Spanish. After graduating in 1983, she freelanced with the Irish Times in Belfast, then started at the Belfast Telegraph, where she became the first female local government correspondent, or the City Hall man, as the news editor called her at the time. So there'll be more on that later, I imagine. So that is my lineup today. The breadth of experience is something else. And today we're going to be discussing their experience of being women in the media, the good, the bad, and everything in between, what changes they've noticed over the years, best practice, and what we can do to make things better. So let's see where the conversation takes us. Before I ask questions, we're going to have some opening remarks from each of the women, and we started with Susan, so we'll go back around the other way and start with Mary on this occasion. So Mary, if you just want to give us some opening remarks, that would be great.
Okay, well, I started on the journalism course at the College of Business Studies in Belfast, which at that time there would have been 10 to 12 places on it. Back in 1975, there were only 3 girls on the course. And I remember applying for a job on the Irish News, and one of my colleagues and my classmates, he had applied and had got an interview. I wondered why I hadn't heard, so I walked around to the Irish News to ask, where is my letter asking me in for an interview? There was a bit of sort of embarrassed scuffling about, And then eventually an executive was found, and he came down and he said, you won't be getting a letter. And I said, why not? And he said, we're not taking on any more girls because the last wee lassie we had was terrible. And I remember standing in the office as people were putting in their death notices and saying, but that's not fair. And they just shrugged and said, that's the way it is. And that was the way it was then. That was 1976. And I remember coming round to tell the journalism lecturer, Joan Fitzpatrick, and she said, yes, I knew that was going to happen, but you had to hear it for yourself.
My goodness.
And that's, you know, you did feel you would be judged if you weren't good. You would be judged not as somebody who was good or bad, but as a woman. And before that, the woman who preceded me didn't stay in journalism, wasn't really cut out for the job.
And which year was that, Mary?
1976. So I think the Sex Discrimination Act came in later, but much later, and much too late for me.
I mean, some employers were worried about young girls because they would get pregnant.
Well, I was told at the time it was to do with reporters being on the Irish News being expected to work at night, which I said, you know, I mean, I had been a waitress, I'd been well used to working at night, and they said it would be covering football matches and things like that. So, you know, that's the way it is.
They thought
and that was
right.
the way it was.
Okay, thank you for that, Mary. Fionnuala, you just give us some opening remarks.
Well, I was thinking, I started just before that, and in '73 I'd been scuffling around Dublin looking for work and looking for my nerve to try and be a journalist, and didn't really know how to go about it, but was getting to know some women journalists, very feisty ones indeed, who were involved in the women's movement, the first women's movement group, as was I. But I was one of the quiet ones who sat at the back, believe it or not. Okay. And they all urged me and encouraged me, and Nell was one of them, and Nell McCafferty. And I got a job in the Irish Times with only a handful of features to my name up to that in different various places. And Donal Foley, who was the news editor at the time, was mainly concerned, I think, to ascertain whether or not, like Nell, I was a lesbian, because he had one lesbian on the staff now, and that was quite enough, thank you. Louis, he was fascinated.
That was their quota.
He was appallingly fascinated. I mean, he did the classic thing of asking Nell. Nell wouldn't deny this, and Donal is dead. What do you do? What is it you do? But and Nell undermined me a bit after about a month inside. She said, Donal's just said to me, are you sure she's the best journalist in Ireland? So she had talked me up. Yeah. But the other very unprofessional thing he asked me was, well, if I had to send you to Belfast and I wanted you to write about the provost, because of course he was a big sticky, I wanted you to write about the provost, would that be difficult for your father? And I was totally baffled. And he meant, would your father be shot if you were writing, because clearly it wouldn't be. But I was also struck there, listening to Mary, by the thought that I did undermine myself, and I think it was because I was overborne by being in such a tiny minority. We were a minority in the staff, though women had been brought in the previous 10 years to great fanfare, and we're all individuals and all had star quality, really. I didn't, I just wanted to be a reporter. And no, it's true, that's all I wanted. But I was overwhelmed by the idea that I hadn't started on a local paper. I didn't have shorthand and typing. I had done one of those sight and sound, hammer, hammer, hammer with a blank keyboard, on a blank keyboard to a metronome ticking in the background.
Right.
So I had perfect, I still have, but I was amazingly slow. Because you weren't supposed to practice while you were doing it. It was a 10-day course. Nobody else remembers these.
No.
They died, I think, after a while. But people used to gather around me in the newsroom to watch me typing with perfect fingering because I was so slow. And there were men sitting either side of me, and there were men sitting opposite me, and they were all dead nice. And the one sitting to the right of me, who was a big thug, really, in appearance, but a quite gentle guy. But he called me Little Inky, which is, kind of sweet, diminutive. But I started on the same day as Conor O'Cleary. Conor started who's had a very lauded career. Conor was a bit older than me, had started very late too. he had not worked anywhere before, I don't think. No, he hadn't. And they started him as a sub. And in those days, subs, while you were intimidated by them, were also not thought to have the same cachet as reporters. Well, in the snotty Irish Times, anyway. And an ad went up one day on the notice board. It said, we want somebody to take over the Belfast office to be the new Northern editor. And I looked at it and thought, God, I wonder who that'll be. Connor applied. Connor was the only person to apply. He got the job. It would no more have occurred to me than to fly, to go, because I thought, I have no experience. Connor didn't think that. Connor did it, seized it, and became the
That's
star.
probably a theme that still occurs to this day.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that. And
Sorry, I was a bit long.
No, you're grand. That's what we're here for.
No, that's really interesting because I was asked to leave school when I was 15, and I did a shorthand typing course with Miss Elliott, and then I was into UTV when I was 17. And I remember the interview of Mr. Colin Lecky-Thompson. They were all English people setting up the studios. And, you know, I sort of thought, this is good fun. I didn't ever think I would, it didn't occur to me that I would or wouldn't get the job. I just went along. And because I'd gone into the office in Donegal Street and said, I think I'd like to work in Ulster Television. And the girl behind the desk said, you and 2,000 others. And I said, my logic, could I be 2001? And she said, oh, don't see why not. So I got an interview. Mr. Lecky-Thompson said to me, you know, what about ambition? What has been your ambition all your life? And I said, only to be a boy. And there was this horrible silence. And he looked at me. I didn't understand why he looked at me like that. And he said, why? And I said, because boys can travel. You know, this was, 1959? Girls can't travel, and I want to travel. And I got the job. Now, in those days, we were all very young. We were a very, very small team. But the desks had modesty boards, if you've ever heard of that.
Wow.
You know, so your legs weren't seen. Sat the desk, but there was a square wooden board in front, hinged onto the desk. I mean, that was, and you wore stockings. Didn't know such things as jeans or trousers. I mean, it was a whole different world in those days. And I don't remember. The only thing I remember about sort of that I didn't quite understand was going upstairs one day in this lovely drindle skirt with butterflies all around the edge and slips underneath so it sat out. And this guy from engineering, a top sort of senior man, smacked me on the bottom. On top of my skirt and said, Nancy girl, because that's a bastardization, Anna's bastardization of Nancy apparently. He said, Nancy girl, you've got great childbearing hips. And I thought, isn't that great? I mean, today you would take that to something called HR, you know, but that wasn't the way it was in those days. You sort of got on with it.
Okay, so this is going to be a good conversation when we get to the changes you've noticed over the years. Susan, some opening remarks from you?
Well, I'm sorry to say that when I first came into journalism, my first full-time job was in the Sunday Tribune. And I was asked at my interview, I talked about having a baby. The picture that I chose as my beginning of career thing was me pregnant, because I sort of thought, I naively thought that was going to be perfectly easy to start a new career while also having a new baby. But I was asked at the interview who was going to look after my children, you know, and that was in 1992, which of course is a long time ago, but I wonder, you know, you're talking about the 70s, and I wonder if things have really dramatically changed all that much. But certainly you do get and I just answered as if it was I knew it wasn't illegal. It was illegal at that stage to ask such a question, but I answered it anyway, you know, because I just kind of assumed, well, they're not going to like you if you start getting stroppy at interview and saying you've no right to ask me that.
Well, I was asked the same question when I went for a job in the BBC. I was pregnant at the time, and it was one of those, you know, everybody pretending that they hadn't noticed you're pregnant and you're 8.5 months gone, and it's very obvious. But at one stage I had a handbag on my shoulder and it slipped off, and 3 men jumped out of their seats to pick it up so that I didn't have to bend down. But it was like, yeah, don't mention the war, you know. And I was asked about how many children I already had. you know, and it was because it was for a political correspondence job that I didn't really want, but I wanted to get an interview.
And that was when, Mary?
That would have been, oh gosh, 2000 and something,
Yeah,
2004 or something
it's
like
all
that.
still there. So there is a need for constant vigilance, I think, among
absolutely.
women
I think
who
they'd
want
be
to
much more careful now, but I think it wasn't asked at the interview. It was asked by one of the panel by way of chit-chat before I went in. And I thought,
And women in politics and political journalism was another leap, another ghetto.
Well, we're going to talk about the media landscape here. So north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, occupied 6-hour-week country, whatever people want to call it. I didn't partition the place, so I'm comfortable with whatever people want to call it.
Heaven.
Heaven, yes, that's right. It feels like a very male place. You know, a very frustrating place at times as well. And I do love where I'm from, but it can feel quite suffocating and oppressive. And I think it was, Susan, you had said it was Arlene that had said that we existed in an armed patriarchy. I'm just wondering, what are your views on this place that we call home and the challenges that that presents for journalists and for covering stories? Anybody?
I think division is probably more of a problem than the gender divide in many ways, because there's always, when you're interviewing people, there's always a little thing that Northern Ireland people have, that little click that when they hear your name, my name, Mary Kelly, is obviously from the nationalist community. And you just see, my first job was in Carrickfergus, and I think I was more aware of them saying, oh, you're a Catholic, rather than you're a woman. Okay. Because I think that is the most obvious thing.
Yeah,
I was more aware of that than gender. I mean, certainly in journalism then, there were fewer women than there are now, but I was more aware of the sectarian divide than the gender one.
Because I wear a cross and I write for the Irish News, everybody assumes I'm a Catholic. I'm actually a Methodist by trade, which means I can be anything I want to be, I think. But I have the advantage of having started a long time before all you girls were even a twinkle in your father's eye.
Oh, come on. I'm 75.
Oh, well, that's
nearly 75.
Apart from Fionnuala.
Yeah. Gives a break.
But you know, I mean, I've been in the media since I was 17.
Sure.
And then because I was writing for newspapers then, went into the BBC first and then UTV, people sort of accept me for just being somebody who will write about them or ask questions or whatever. I don't think it only happened in England. That I know that a couple of people said to me, but you're Catholic, aren't you? And I said, well, I could be if you want me to be, you know.
It's the right attitude.
But, you know, I think I'm a wee bit, now privilege is a stupid word, but I think in this case, I am a wee bit privileged because people accept me.
So I think because both of my names, it's hard to tell. Like Amanda's a Latin name, so you can't really tell, but Ferguson is you know, it's clearly, and people assume because of my name that I'm a Protestant, which I'm not. I'm not even really a Catholic either, I'm an atheist, but that's neither here nor there. I'm a recovering Catholic. But some people will judge me based on that. But I think that it's definitely something that you're right about, you know, people trying to work you out during the conversation, but that happens in all of conversations we have, whether they're in...
What school did you go to?
But that doesn't work for me, because I went to St. Therese of Lisieux Primary School, and then I went to Belfast Royal Academy, so they're like, oh, how can we work her out?
I started quite early in my career as a journalist, focusing on my own community, the Protestant community. And I used to notice a thing, especially when I did the first book that I did about that community, Northern Protestants and Unsettled People, which was just after the Good Friday Agreement. And when I was interviewing some people, they would go through that whole process with me of, where did you say you were from? And what's this you said your second name was, and everything. And sometimes, eventually, I would say, I'm from a Protestant background. And then these people's tone would completely change. And having been sort of, oh, we don't have much bother around here, or anything like that. And as soon as I said I was from a Protestant background, the people who had wanted to know would almost invariably start saying, see those Catholics, they're taking over this whole town, and they're asking for this and they're asking for that, and I don't know what's going to happen next. And, you know, it was quite extraordinary. But on the gender side of things, when I did that book, I was much, much younger and looked much younger. And people used to say to me afterwards, how did you get those men to tell you those things? And I really do think it was because they thought I was just a wee girl and I wouldn't understand anyway. So they might as well blather away and tell me all these things because I wasn't going to be able to understand.
Really?
You know, yeah. And there's an interview that I listened to recently because I needed a clip from it, which I didn't really remember how bad it had gone. But it was after the book had come out, and I'd done a story about a man who was being bullied because he had spoken out about how school children were being radicalised by Drumcree, and it was impossible to teach them in school because they were all just completely sort of preoccupied with building barricades and fighting and stuff, you know. And anyway, I was trying to stand up for this man because these guys were just piling on him. And in the course of the interview, at one stage, I was referred to by a senior Orange man and unionist politician as this wee girl. And then at a later stage, he called me Goebbels, all in the course of this one interview, you know.
That would
it was just incredible,
cartoon,
you know.
You morph it.
Yeah. But I didn't even remember it having happened that way. But what I do remember is, what I do remember was that I was doing it from a studio in Dublin, and the sound man, once he knew it was an interview about Northern politics, was so bored and uninterested that he had left the studio, and the sound went down, and I was left sort of sitting there while I knew that these guys were all giving out about me and calling me names, and I was sitting there not able to respond because the sound was gone. It was a horrible experience.
And for the purposes of my fellowship, I've been trying to dig into what the media landscape is in the north, who are we, how many journalists are working here, and so on. Trying to get the data on that has proven quite difficult. It's a work in progress, but it's proven quite challenging. Thankfully, the membership department at the National Union of Journalists have given me some information about the data that they hold on how many members there are in both jurisdictions on the island. So as of the end of July, they said that there's just over 3,100 NUJ members in both jurisdictions across the island, that there are 2,304 members in the Republic, 803 members in the North, and women account for 34% in the Republic and 33% in the North. Now that chimes with other sectors like politics, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are if we are half of the population or more than half of the population, why so often are we only a third of the roles?
It'd be interesting to have those statistics for 10 years ago, though.
Yeah, well, the wider stats for across these islands is that there's 100,000 people identify as journalists, which is nearly double what it was 15 years ago. But we do have to take into consideration a lot of people identify themselves as journalists when perhaps they're not. But certainly, you know, if you were just going on the NUJ membership, which you would think would be sort of roughly, you know, what it would be overall, including you know, non-members of trade unions as well, like women make up a third. I was quite shocked by that. I don't know whether you were shocked by that.
I think as well, if you broke it down further, you'd probably find that it's the same as almost all of the professions, that if you start looking at the bottom layer of it, there'll be a higher proportion of women, and if you start going up to the editorial level, you know, editors and chief editors and all the rest of it, you'll find there's an even greater proportion of men there.
Yeah, we see that with our own eyes and who we deal with in the course of our work.
I mean, you'll see that, but also the other side of that is then, and I know this as mostly working as a self-employed freelance journalist, as all of us, I suppose, here now know, it's really, really hard to make a living. So I think a lot of women, because they're going to be at the lower levels of it, or they're not going to get the full-time jobs, they're not going to get the big positions, just don't see it as a viable way of making a living, which is really sad, but I do think it's probably true.
Is that not the same for the men, though? You know, on that sort of level?
Yeah,
the
but you've
woman's
more
not getting a
chance.
lot, but the man's probably getting the same.
Yeah, but there's more chance of going up the ladder as a man, I think, and I think that is perceived to be the case.
Well, I was a reporter on the Belfast Telegraph, and then I became a correspondent. And once I started to have children, I realised that there were difficulties there with trying to. I mean, I think it was back in the late 80s. I was in the Belfast Telegraph, and myself and another woman who both had young children asked about job sharing, and it was as if we'd asked, could we go to the moon? We did a lot of research into how well job shares worked, and we give all this data about how, in fact, an employer was benefiting from job shares, because if you work 5 days, your last day of that week, you're tailing off. Whereas if you have two people who are very committed to making it work, they work harder and you get more. And with newspaper journalism, each day was on its own, so it wasn't even that you had to hand over. There was no difficulty, though all the women who were keen on it said they wouldn't have any problem with doing handovers in their own time in the evening and things like that. But the Telegraph management just wouldn't hear of it.
What about today?
So I left.
Yeah, but today they would probably entertain the idea.
Well, they did. And when I went to the BBC initially as a freelance, and I was just doing whatever shifts, suited me. And then when a job came up, they put it in the ad. This is open to job share candidates.
That's progress.
And the then boss kept taking it out. And there was a stand-up, because one of the women from HR told me afterwards that they had a stand-up row because he said, I don't want any part-timers. And they said, this woman said to him, I don't care what you want, this is BBC policy. And so it went in, and then I did get it as a job share candidate.
There's a woman standing up for women.
Yeah, but they had to actually change it. They had to make it, the legislation had to be changed. And it took that. And I think there have been a lot of women who probably would have maybe given up or just stopped doing it. And I think the problem for a lot of women was when they're doing it part-time, they start to lose. I mean, I started as a reporter in the BBC initially, and because I was part-time, once they introduced new technology where you would be cutting and editing your own pieces, because I wasn't doing it as often, I started to fall behind with the training. And then I found it was easier to do production instead of being out and using the equipment and things like that. And I think there are probably more young women in it now, but it's a precarious living. In fact, it's far more precarious than it was when I started, because people are on short-term contracts.
And it is precarious for the men as well. I mean,
Yes, it is. It's a precarious
business.
job,
and
precarious
sector.
Yeah, it is absolutely.
I mean, it's badly paid work.
It's
no matter
badly
who
paid
you
work
are,
for the responsibility, but it's difficult for people to get beyond those early stages.
And this is all on top of, I suppose I'm trying to bring it back to political journalism again, for no good reason, except that it's the one I know best. All of those drag factors, if that's what they're called, are on top of the well-founded perception that everybody has here of it being a male political world, or a political world that's been male-dominated. So women, until very recently, when things changed quite rapidly, we're looking at a world of politics in which there were hardly any women, and those who were there were so publicly disregarded and disrespected. Why in the name of goodness would you want as a woman to go in and work on that? And then you were also going to be working in a pool of males largely, who came with mixed attitudes, some of whom were very supportive and some of whom were looking at you. When I started anyway, I just remember feeling, well, flip me, there's only me.
In the early,
I mean, that wasn't true. There were other men, there were other women as well, but very few were.
But you proved yourself.
Yeah, but
then you got their respect, I would hope.
I don't know, Anne.
Really?
I didn't think of it like that either, to be honest. I didn't. The period of and maybe this is jumping, Amanda, jumping ahead. The period of the worst of the Troubles, and I only came in on the end of that by coming in at 73. I missed, I'm very glad, 72. But that period was so hectic for everybody, I think, that you didn't get time to reflect on anything other than what you were immediately doing, trying to keep your feet mentally, trying to keep your head, and trying to write. Well, because I was lucky, I was writing in the genteel Irish Times. I wasn't doing what Mary had to do. I wasn't doing the death knocks. We didn't have to do that. We had time to write, and there was a fair bit among other journalists regardless of gender, of envy of us for having a lot of space and, and mockery that went with that. And they were quite right, because it was a different kettle of fish.
But that's jealousy, isn't it?
Say it again?
That's jealousy.
Oh, I don't know. Well, it was
so.
professional jealousy, but it cut across the gender. It wasn't to do. All I mean is, I barely thought, apart from there aren't many other women. Yeah. And there were, but they weren't there because they were in the Irish news, like Marion Soy and Anne Purdy in the newsletter, whose papers didn't privilege them as much as, because once I was in the Belfast office, it wasn't a question of proving yourself. There were only a small band of us, and it was a fellowship of brothers, I nearly said, and there was a lot of in-house rough mockery and black humour.
Yes.
It was David McKittrick and eventually Ed Maloney, but it was David McKittrick and Walter Ellis initially, which was kind of antic fun, and a lot of it wouldn't stand up now politically to political correct invigilation.
But it was fun.
But it was very funny, wasn't it, Mary?
The dark humours remain within journalism, even in these times. But I wanted to touch a little bit on being older women within the media, more mature women can.
What do you mean?
To be
Well, I
can tend to be sidelined, seasoned. Okay, so no,
mellowed.
Yeah, but like you hear these stories.
Like, why?
You hear stories about, once women reach a certain maturity, that they're moved off TV into radio, or they're not given as many opportunities as their male counterparts. Is that something that you're conscious of, Mary?
In broadcasting, that used to be the case. I don't think it is the case anymore.
It's something that impacts writers as well as broadcasters.
Absolutely.
Gosh, yes.
Well, on pay, absolutely.
But I think a lot of it is our sense of being a bit precarious in a profession that has been traditionally male, because most of the women who have become well known in journalism are quite stroppy in the end. The people who survive, you have to end up being quite stroppy and being willing to be unpopular.
But at the beginning, I was sweet and shy.
Yeah, but it didn't. But I bet you regret that now. I bet you
It took a long time.
I mean, I bet
do
you
regret
regret that.
I do regret
the times. I mean, I shouldn't have accepted that answer in the same ballpark.
That's right.
I should have said, well, look, I'm actually the union rep in this paper, which I was at the time. And why the hell didn't I challenge that?
Yeah.
Because it's much easier to challenge for other people than it is for yourself, of course.
Yes,
But, I would certainly be saying to women coming into our profession now, be stroppy, be what they call obnoxious, be difficult, because it's not actually going to progress your career by
But there were
not
the
being
voices
those things.
There were voices from different angles. It's not going to. That's absolutely true. Voices in your ears from different angles. Like we both worked with a lovely woman who was the secretary. Only I insisted she should call herself the office administrator.
Yeah.
And her daughter came in to work during the holidays instead of her mother, and she was a bit gormless and innocent. And she said, "I'd like to be in journalism," and I thought, "No, you wouldn't. You haven't a clue, and you're not really interested at all." And she said, "Except Mummy says it makes women hard."
Hard.
And the only woman journalist her mummy knew was me. And I was her friend and supporter.
Tough we not.
Makes them very hard. But that was there was something there at the back of your head, I think.
Well, sometimes when I've been out in because mostly I've worked in newspapers or in print journalism, and sometimes I've been in RTE and BBC, and you see these young women who are in there interning, and they are often, potentially really brilliant young women, and they possibly have PhDs. They certainly have the same experience of the young men, but they're kind of swishing around, looking gorgeous, wearing really high heels, making coffee for men.
Well,
and you
that
think,
wasn't the
just cut that out.
Yes,
Look at the shoes on us. There's not a heel among us.
Well, that pressure wasn't on. I mean, I don't remember thinking I've got to look better, because I never believed that would work. But moderating the voice, perhaps, or or not appearing as hard as it was, tough as it was.
I had a friend who was worked for the IDB, and she was very high up, and she was at a conference, an internal conference, a sort of board thing, and they came to sort of 11 o'clock, and we'll pause now for a cup of coffee. Would you mind? And she said, "I would mind very much."
She's quite right.
She said, I will get one of the juniors to do it," which she did. So, and they just laughed at her.
Sorry to interrupt. I remember a male colleague, telling me that he'd gone out to interview Arlene Foster, This is long before she became...
Was pleasurable or profitable?
Well, it was... Anyway, one of the things that they used to do when they were filming somebody in their house, and it was a sort of televisual cliche, was to have them boiling a kettle and making a cup of tea. So this reporter said to Arlene Foster, "Would you mind if we filmed you making a cup of tea?" And she said, "No." And he looked at her and said, "Sorry?" And she said, "Would you ask Ken Maginnis to make a cup of tea?" And he said, "No." And then she says, "Well, I'm not making one either."
Yeah.
And I thought,
Yeah, good for her.
good for her.
Yeah.
You know, she did notice that was, and it was, and the reporter himself said, "It didn't actually occur to me
No.
until she
And
said
he would never
that,
say it again.
that I would never have
Yeah.
asked him. I just would have said."
Yeah.
And I said, "Yeah, because her domain is the kitchen in your head." And he went, "No, I don't think that." And then he went, "Well, maybe I did." You know?
But
He didn't ask it again.
There is a problem just about about men not noticing women, I think, you know, and that happens, you know, right across. I've heard Edna all across the whole field of writing. Like, I've heard Edna O'Brien talk about this, and Anne Enright, you know, who come from different generations of women within Irish writing, book writing, fiction writing, and you know, I remember hearing Edna O'Brien saying, "Men just don't like books by women." And Anne Enright said the same. You know, if you ask men to name the books that they like, that they've read, they will probably name books by men. And I think it has a profound, in terms of our profession, it really does have profound implications, because if men don't notice women in their own profession, nor do they notice women in society, you know, so because I had worked as a feminist activist before I was a journalist, I sort of came with a contacts book stuffed with women for a start, but also I was very conscious of the need to make women visible. So I would always try to have a balance of women's voices in my stories, you know. And several times I had editors sort of saying to me, "There's no men in that story," you know? But I don't remember
Really?
ever being
Good Lord.
anybody ever saying there's no women in that story, you know. And it's still the same. I mean, one of the reasons why I try to bring a lot of women into my books is because you would think there are hardly any women in Northern Ireland if you just looked at the media in terms of who is asked. And that has implications as to what we think politics is. You know, like if you take that whole thing recently where the DUP went out and courted the Loyalist Communities Council, which is an entirely white male organisation, and they brought them in sort of to say, well, these are spokespersons for the Loyalist community. And I was thinking, no, they're not. I know people who have a far greater claim to be spokespersons for the Loyalist community
Than David Campbell.
And it so happens that they are working class women who have been running women's centres, and they know exactly what the people in certain areas want and need and feel about Northern Irish politics. But nobody ever asks them.
Sometimes
you know?
they do ask them, I have to say. I was a producer for a long time in the BBC, and we did try a lot, because sometimes you would look at the end of every programme, say, one woman in that, and you know. And we did, but there was, and I think it is changing, but there often was a reluctance for women. Women preferred to just do it. They didn't want to be seen to be doing it particularly. I mean, one stage we had 3 women MPs. 2 of them would not do television interviews.
You've actually neatly brought me on to the next topic that I wanted to talk about marginalised voices and about diversity. Obviously, Northern Ireland is a very white place, but the media is very white. It's very... you know, you have lots of manels. You do have the examples of whenever it's only men's voices that are being heard, and that, you know, if you're saying that some women aren't taking up the opportunity to do it, why is that happening? You know, what can we do? Like, in your analysis, the media landscape here. You know, this isn't about knocking colleagues or about pretending that everything's perfect, but we definitely need to work harder on this, because at the International Women's Day conference that I helped organise earlier this year, it was very clear that disabled women, loyalist women, women of colour were having negative experiences with the media and how that they were treated, or, you know, the opportunity that they had to talk. How can we, you know, I was jokingly saying I don't want, you know, to be about grumbles. I'm trying to look for solutions as well. How do we make that better?
But did those women, were they saying that because they were being interviewed by men?
In some circumstances, it was poor, like disabled women being asked to look more disabled because
No,
they
I
had
don't think a woman would ever say that. I don't think a woman would ever say that.
Well, it
Wouldn't ever
kinda
occur to
shocking.
me.
Yeah, or
anybody say that?
or members of the black community only being invited to talk about racism as if that's the only thing that they have to contribute to the conversation, that they have to talk about hate crime. They can't talk about anything other than that. They don't have opinions on anything else that we talk about.
Maybe that was the subject, Amanda.
Yeah,
that was being addressed.
It happened, but if that's the only thing they're being invited to talk about, I think it was the issue that they don't. They're not allowed to have opinions on politics. Nobody cares what they think about, and I think it could be particular to this part of the world because it's a post-conflict society, because we're obsessed with orange and green, and that tends to be the lens that's put on everything. But even in the conversations that like I'm invited on to talk about race and things like that, and I'm thinking, well, I can give an opinion on it, but like someone with the experience is going to be better. So how do we encourage more women and more of those marginalised voices to get involved, and how do we make sure that they get the platform?
Well, I have no power and no reach anymore, and probably never did, never had a title. No, I didn't. I was never in control of anything to be able to send people out to do things. Yeah. And the only thing I've ever thought I could do is if people ask me to do something, I say, no, why don't you use so and so and so and so and so and so. So maybe that's one way. Everybody, and I mean, Susan's, which hadn't occurred to me, that you've been doing that all along, that you're writing women into everything that you. So I suppose if you're a practitioner, even a semi-retired practitioner, that's one way you do it, that you're asked to do something and you think, no, this is not for me. But it could be for, but it means you have to keep up to date, and it means you have to have names at your...
But Fionnuala, I write for a woman's page. Should there be a woman's page?
It's
called like Women's Are, Women's Are,
well,
which I can't bear, but that's only my hang-up. But
Well, they used to have that in The Guardian. There used to be Guardian women, and then that
and
just
even
became,
in the Times,
just became Me Too, and it's
Women's Notebook or whatever.
They take the women off it. Yeah.
Well, Fionnuala, when you went into the Irish Times, wasn't it that when you were talking about that legendary generation which you were part of in the Irish Times, not just a little bit part player, you were regarded as one of those legendary
No, I really
women.
wasn't. I really wasn't, Susan. I came north.
Well, you
dropped
were,
out of that
I was
completely.
I was slightly younger than you, and I looked up to you in the same way.
Thank you very much. But
So there was yourself and Nell and Nuala O'Connor and people like that, and would women like that? You were writing in a woman's page, weren't you? Initially,
Initially, we didn't want to be. She was on her way out of it.
But it was a women's page initially, wasn't it?
And there was room for it, and it was needed, and it was part of the age. And the Guardian Women's page, I think, was the same thing. They were very much needed. And the fact that a lot of them were very strong women and very, very vivid writers made a big part. But I couldn't wait to get out of it. I wanted to be a reporter, and they sent me back up north, and I did not want to come back north. Yeah. But I knew I had to try it at least. And they said, you can come back and we'll
But sometimes when you think of it, it's hard to imagine a group of women like that being allowed in one paper now, isn't it? I mean,
you've concertinaed them, Susan. They weren't all there at the same time. I mean, no wonder. And Nell Nell went out of the women's page into, I don't know that she ever really was in it. It was a floating concept. Where she did her big work and her great work was in the courts.
The courts,
and she broke all the rules on that, and it wasn't her idea. It was Mrs. Guy's idea, who's the woman in whose restaurant we used to meet, and who sat in the courts. She was an amazing character. She would sit in court every day with her huge black bag between her feet, full of money, to go bail for the people who could not afford to go bail.
Oh, really?
Only ordinary decent criminals. She wouldn't do political. Well, she was pre the Troubles, really. She started it, and she was huge, and she had this big bag, and she commanded the court. And she was so disgusted with the way the judges treated, and the police, some of the police, not all the police, and the lawyers treated the poor defendants. The courts then, whereas the courts now, the people who flowed through them were the poor, the sick, you know, and they'd be the immigrants now. She suggested somebody ought to do that every day, and Nell did, and it made a difference. It really did make a difference.
Do you think part of the coverage that happens in Northern Ireland is because of the legacy of the past, because of the post-conflict society that we live in, that a lot of the coverage is driven down those sort of two routes? Because a lot of times, you know, people say to me, like, there's no room for other, there is no room, and even the fact that they're called others is an issue as well. Do you think that's...
Well, in terms of your original question there about what we can do, I mean, I think the first thing is to bring in those voices, but also to encourage people from those backgrounds to speak out. And sometimes I do think that, you know, because there is such a lack of confidence among a lot of women about speaking out, you know, there's definitely a place for confidence building type courses for women, which could be organised by the women in the media, you know, giving...
Well, I suppose it's what you're doing.
It's something something we're working on at the minute.
This hopefully will feed into such things. But you know, just talking to people about talking in the media. I mean, I worked on a thing recently. It was guidelines for journalists working with victims of trauma. You know, I mean, there are ways in which you can encourage people to feel that they're not as little in control as they think they are when they're talking to the media. I mean, I used to think if a microphone was put in front of me, I had to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But you don't. You can hold things back. You hadn't heard of Trump? You can say what you want to say and hold back things. Sometimes I think people are afraid to speak because they're afraid that they'll be asked to say more than they feel they can or they feel willing to. But
that's probably the first thing you should tell anybody new.
Yeah,
a very good point.
You can say no. Yeah. You can say, look, I came on here to talk about this. I'm not going to talk about that. Or I'm sorry, that's just not somewhere I'm willing to go for you. Or you know, people can do that.
I think as well the online world has opened things. That's obviously a difference that's progressed over the years, and it seems when any woman with an opinion raises their voice up, that there's just a barrage of people ready to tell them that they're wrong or to try and diminish them or belittle them, and that happens to me and to colleagues a lot. But I always have to remember that most people who get in touch are dead on. Most people are sound, or complimentary, or nice, or engaging in a positive way online. So it is a minority, but you can see how it will be off-putting to people who to not hard women, as perhaps.
Well, the women politicians who spoke out, the Carla Lockharts and Arlene Foster and other people. I mean. Yeah. That was something we didn't have in our time. The social media thing I find absolutely appalling. Bullying and nastiness, and the degree of total woman hatred in it is absolutely devastating at times.
Why are people on Twitter?
Well, I go on Twitter, but I go on Twitter too because I'm a journalist. I want to know what people are talking about. Yeah. But I mean, yes, I suppose you can block people if they're nasty, but sometimes I don't actually know the nasty piece until maybe yourself or another journalist, Alison Morris, for example, will show some of the stuff, and you think, I mean, I do think Twitter have a lot of responsibility. I don't see why they can't be shut down as soon as, they trespass into that area.
Online hasn't made people misogynist. It's just given misogynists another platform. But there's
an anonymous platform. That's why I would, by and large, I think the anonymity is where they find it easy, because it's easy to be a bully and nasty when you're anonymous.
But also our bosses all have a big responsibility to backing us with what we're trying to do. And the more encouragement like that we all get, the more you talk to younger ones and say, look, there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are good people, and just keep on keeping on. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah.
It is about changing the scope of the idea of what publications consider to be news, though, isn't it? Because there is quite a narrow idea sometimes.
But then there are
what is
features
news.
and features, you see, which is so much easier.
Yeah, except features departments in newspapers are really becoming just freelance because the staffing of newspapers is, I think, very worrying.
Because there's not enough staff and there's too much use.
I mean, just the numbers are going down and down and down, and that doesn't allow for time. I mean, you talked about the Irish Times. I mean, we were absolutely jealous of the Irish Times because we'd say, God, you've all day to write this, and then you can nicely turned phrase. But they had, I mean, at one time, the Northern Office, the Belfast office, had 4 journalists. I mean, I worked in the Telegraph, and there were people covering councils like I was. There was a Labour correspondent. There were local, there was a whole range of people looking at different facets of, of society. And there's none of that now. And, I think journalists who are working now they're very reduced in what they can do because
and the
of
PR
time
companies are climbing up.
Smaller, readerships as well.
And you're asking this at exactly the wrong time, in a sense. You're saying, is there this post-conflict thing which which puts everything through that prism? What you're really hoping for is a broadening out at exactly the time when everything has narrowed in. And when resources are smaller and workforces are largely freelance.
And there's also such a reliance now on opinion.
Yes.
Because it's cheaper than
I feel ashamed of
that.
We're
research.
Part of, we're the staple of a
that's
newspaper.
how they fill their space.
That's right.
Now.
And a lot of old people, we're starting with F and ending with S, would do it for nothing. Would do it for nothing, and perhaps do. Not you, although I now have my doubts.
Not me.
And it's in restraint of trade of younger people.
If you all were starting your careers again, is there anything that you would do differently? And maybe if you could give a piece of advice to women coming into journalism and the media now?
Well, Susan did it. Susan said, be stroppy, be bolshy. Don't be wafting around making tea for people.
Don't wait until somebody else thinks you have value.
That's the big one. I always thought, well, they're going to tell me when I'm good at something.
That's what I thought.
I'm going to get promotion. But never happened.
Yes.
Well, my advice would be the same as for a woman in any profession. Don't let the bastards grind you down, because they will try, and some of the best journalists around are women, and many of them don't get the recognition that they should do. And they don't get the promotion that they should do, and they don't get the space in the paper that they should do. So, I mean, I think it's also really important that women, who, as they get on in their profession, look after young women coming in, and look to young women coming in, and don't see them as a threat to your position. Give them the support. Because I was terrified going into journalism. I was really scared, and I was working for some quite scary men. You can see young women looking very brave and feisty, and you can be quite jealous of them because they are young and they're starting out and everything, but they're probably also quite scared and would be so grateful for a bit of support from women who know the ropes a bit.
And I think it's confidence.
I just think being generous to younger women.
And certainly, I mean, in my day, if anything went wrong, I'm talking about the UTV early days and even later, if anything went wrong for me and I didn't know what to do, there was always a girl ahead of me, a woman called Jean Clark, and I would go to Jean and say, I'm being bullied at the moment, or she would say to me, what's going on? There's something going on. And she said, I'm making an appointment for you to go and see the ultimate boss. And I said, no, I'm just going to go. I couldn't put up with this. And she said, no. And then she came back 10 minutes time, knock on that door and go in. And she said, and think like a man. And I said, okay.
No, and that's a question maybe and maybe that is a piece of advice you would give. Try to write, try not to let them make the story about you. I mean, I keep reading, I keep seeing things by very well written things about my difficulty combining a baby and work, and it's as if it never happened before. It's as if nobody has ever had a baby and worked at the same time. But they're asked to do it, I suppose. But just an awful lot of journalism by women has become confessional journalism. And for some, that's it, and they write it very well, and who could write it better? But I think it's another niche. It's another form of being sidelined and
But on the other side
Yeah.
of that coin, you now do see a lot of really brilliant women in sports journalism, for example,
That's
which
I
didn't
don't
used to
read
happen
and
until
should,
quite
yes.
recently.
Yeah.
So it is
Yes.
changing in good ways for
That's
women too.
That's right. And of course, underneath all of that is women are so diverse, so good at doing stuff right across the board, whereas an awful lot of men, because they haven't been forced to do it, are not.
And we have that sort of brain because you're
Yeah.
running a house.
We can do two things
You're
at the
running
same time.
children,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
being a
Yeah.
nursemaid.
Bit of that.
You're all those
Bit of that.
things.
Yeah, but
Therefore,
that leaves you wide open for exploitation.
It does.
It's not
No, but I mean, you've
And
that sort
runs you
of brain,
ragged.
that sort of brain that you can departmentalize things.
I mean, this
And then that way
menopause
cope.
thing at the minute, that
Yeah,
bothers me.
it
I'm not
does
sure
me
I
too.
like. I'm not sure I like this.
I don't either.
No,
Why?
What do you mean?
Well,
what are you talking about?
by all means, it shouldn't be unspeakable. It should not be. It should be. You know, it's a big part of life. It's a big part of women's lives. We are a big part of the population. Nobody should ever have felt it was shameful and shouldn't be spoken. But I just get a bit uneasy at the knock it down, drag it out. You know, all the details for weeks on end or months on end. And I think, is that really helpful to younger women? Maybe part of me is thinking, all right, this is terrible confession, that it's like childbirth, that there are bits of it you want to keep to yourself because you don't want to tell younger women because you'd scare the shit out of them.
Yeah. Never do it again.
Yeah, like I found myself very tempted to tell my daughter who was complaining about how cold the house was, and our house is not cold, but it's been very muggy lately, muggy. And I was tempted to say to her, I think my thermostat's been gone since the menopause, and I thought, don't tell her that. She's about 10 years off, at least, the beginning of, don't tell her that, because nobody told me that. And it mightn't be true, and I'm sure it's not true for everybody.
Just feel it's another stick to beat women with.
Yeah.
You only get past oh God, well, the trouble is if you employ a woman, then she's going to be off so many years with childbearing. And then you get past that stage and I say, oh God, they're going to be menopausal next
That's right.
And
do you
demanding this, that, or the other thing.
Well, it only happened to me once on air. I was sitting facing Noel Thompson, and I don't think I told you this later. It maybe wasn't your programme. And there was somebody else there, a man, I presume, because there's always a woman and a man. Yeah, some man. And Noel asked me a question, and just as I was about to start answering it, I got that dreadful. I was really lucky. I got hot flushes, which weren't visible. But there was that second of. Do you remember? Second of. You're too young.
No, I
second
don't know.
of. Second of
shit
panic.
myself. I'm the one that's
Second of
panicking
panic.
now.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Second of panic before it would start. You'd feel the panic, and I don't know whether the panic was the beginning of the heat, but there was something like panic, and I felt the panic, and I thought, oh, flip. And as I thought that, my mind went totally blank. What he asked me disappeared. And fortunately, he was not as wordy as his successor, nor anything like it, but he went on for a second more, and it came back to me. And, I was looking at him, he didn't see it in my eyes. Later, I thought, I'm not going to say that to him. Yeah.
I think another thing I would say to young women going into journalism as well is, though, just be careful of your ideas, because as in other professions, there is that syndrome where, you'll have an editorial meeting and women will come up with ideas, and others, sometimes women, but mostly men, I think, will then promptly go off and nick the idea,
Although the one I heard the best.
It's very like that, that cartoon where there's a group of men sitting around a desk, and there's a man who obviously chairing the meeting, and a woman has just obviously spoken earnestly about something, and the chairman of the meeting is saying, that's an excellent point, Miss Ferguson. Would one of you gentlemen like to make it? And there are all those kind of things that go on. There are men who don't notice that women have actually been the people who have said something. They'll give the ideas to other men. They'll think the men will do it better or whatever. And that is definitely still going on. And so I think I would say to young women, be careful with your ideas.
But I think that's something
make sure you get the commission before you get the full
but that's,
details.
That's something you have to say to every freelance or all
freelance.
It's a
thing in every profession.
It
I
is.
think.
Yeah.
Okay, I wish you wouldn't call it a profession, Susan. I don't
It's a
think
trade.
I think it's a craft.
It's a
I think it's a craft.
Jerry told me.
I don't like profession because it's been such a fake razor up of
It's a
some
trade
jobs.
union,
and
isn't it? We belong to a trade
But the best
union.
description
Well,
I
I
got...
find it hard to certainly to speak about my career because such a ramshackle construction can hardly be called a career.
No, it isn't. It's endlessly adapted and flexible.
Flexible,
But the best description I ever heard of that stealing of an idea came from a man, McKittrick, who had his idea stolen by a woman whom I will not name.
Really?
And they were sitting in the green room, or no, they were sitting in the studio about to go on air, and he said, "Didum, didum, didum," and she said, "Oh yeah," and then the lights went on, and the guy said, the chair said, "So what do you think?" And she said, "Well." And he said, she did it so well. She probably did it better than I would have done.
Yeah.
No,
But I'll never.
It's happened. It's happened to me, but it's with other women. Sometimes you get people, and you're sitting around, and the ideas are flowing, and then you get what I call a note taker. You know, the note taker who writes it all down and then sends it off on a nicely crafted email. That's happened to me before. It's been another woman.
Sends it off in an email.
Oh yes, the ideas that you know, you have these discussions, and then she'll sit and write them all down, and then it'll be sent off to the boss, and then the boss will come and say, X.
Okay,
had
so then
a really
we have
good
to add
idea.
an addendum then. Don't assume all other women are your friends.
Don't always. They're not always.
Yes, absolutely.
It was Bernadette Devlin at the film festival. She was talking about how she got a lot of her ideas from the Black Panther women, and it was not every woman is my sister. And we're not going to end on that note because it has, we have to be more positive about each other. But definitely what you're talking about having the I share everything with younger women journalists because I have confidence in myself that I do my own thing. I've never felt as if I'm competing with them, or you know, I know that people feel as if they're competing with me, but I'm just trying to compete with myself to do a good job or try to improve on my craft, as you know, because we've no careers and there's no profession. But it's definitely wise words because people do need that support. It's about solidarity, really.
Well, and that's another one of the things that's gone in this squeezing. The mentors have gone. I mean, both the ones to back you up against bullying, but also the ones to help with the craft, to say the sub who would have time to tell you afterwards how.
Maybe because of freelancing.
Well,
not
partly
always
freelancing,
there, you know.
partly freelance, but also there's a whole generation of time and.
I've only ever been freelance, and I actually like it. Because of the variety. I know that it's precarious, but I enjoy the variety that you get to do.
But a bit of feedback wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, well, that's true.
You know, you don't get any.
You don't so much in the Irish media, I think, but I work for publications in England and America now a bit, and I think you get much more editorial engagement and
it's not just fact checking.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. Maybe there's just more money, and maybe I'm just working for publications that have more money elsewhere. But definitely, I love editing. I love the editing process, and I love having a toing and froing with somebody who will say, "Well, you're can see what you're trying to do there, but you're not quite getting it, and why don't you try this or that and the other thing." But often with Irish papers you don't get that. You send a thing in and you kind of assume it's going to be in the paper because you don't hear back from anybody. And there it is the next day with a big chunk cut off the end because it was too long or something. You know, but I think that young women and older women coming into the profession, because it isn't always about just young women, they just need people to give them the degree of confidence that they need to actually be themselves, and because journalism is changing, and there's lots that we can't tell young women because they know stuff we don't know. I mean, when Lyra McKay died, people assumed because I had been friendly with her that I must have been her mentor, but maybe I was to a degree, but she was just as much my mentor. She used to tell me about all kinds of things I had no idea about that you could do, and you know, things that you could do online, and work that you could access online, and publications that I didn't even know about that operated online and stuff. So it was very much, you know, we have as much to learn from young women as they have from us in terms of openings and all the rest of it. But I definitely, as a feminist, believe that solidarity is key to it.
I think I'm going to end with a final question just about, you know, we've talked about the ups and the downs and the different stages of careers. Just the best thing about being a woman in media, or being a journalist, being a writer, being an author. What have you enjoyed most about this craft that we're all part of? It's not a real job. I've always said that to people. I've had proper jobs. I've had actual jobs before.
I suppose it is a treat to feel that you have said something fairly well. You've either said it out loud fairly well, or you've found a way of saying it in print. And to be paid for doing that, even not paid well, is a bit of a privilege. But it still feels a bit like playing.
Yeah. And what about you?
I think possibly because throughout my life, everything I've done has brought me into contact with people who I am asking them to trust me, to do a good job on their behalf. And when you get it right, I mean, and they maybe phone you and say, thank you. That is terrific. You know, you get the PR companies chasing you to do various things. If it's a really good story, I would follow through. And they maybe have been on the phone 10 times saying, you know, are you going to do it or you're not going to do it? And I said, just, you know, hang on, you've passed it to me, I'll make a decision. And then you do it, and you never hear from them. And you sort of think, you know, they badgered me. Why don't they just ring up? Oh, that's my ego. Or maybe my lack of self-confidence, I don't know. But it does make such a difference when you've represented somebody, made them feel at ease, maybe heard their, as so often it is, their terrible traumas and their sadnesses, or the heights of delight. And to get that right in their eyes is, to me, the important thing.
Mary, what about you?
I think, looking back, it's been a very interesting life, and it gives you insights into how other people live. And I think, you know, when Anne says it's right, people trusting you is important, and you like to think, hopefully you've repaid that trust by representing them as fairly and accurately as possible. It spoils you for other jobs, though.
I love being a journalist. I love being a writer, and all of the things that people have said. I mean, you've got the right to go and ask people really nosy questions that nobody else gets to ask other people. Yeah. You get to go into places that other people don't. You get to see society in a much deeper way than most people get a chance, because most people have to just go along a certain path, and they have to live in a certain place and know people in their community or whatever. You know, it really does open up the world to you. But also, I just have never been able to do anything else. It seems to be the only thing that I can do.
You'll never do anything as interesting again. I think that's what spoils you.
No. And there's always a book at the, well, you've done it, but there's always a book at the end of your time.
Oh dear.
No, I don't. What I mean is, you know, you gather up so much during your career. And it's a lovely thing. I mean, I've done one all about UTV in the early days, and it's history. You're writing history, I'm writing history. And it's very important to put it between two covers, I think. And I mean, I do this speaking thing to organisations, and I'm always saying, especially to women, please go home and write a diary, and then write for your grandchildren. Write what it was like as when you were growing up. I mean, that is the privilege of being able to put pen to paper, you know, that you can actually write down all these important things that will just drift away in the annals of time, and nobody will ever know of the things that happened.
First draft of history, I suppose what it is.
What do you think, Amanda? What's your view of it?
I think that I love this job. It doesn't feel like work, even though it can be mentally tiring and exhausting, and you constantly have to be on and you know, across the detail. You know, because some people think it seems easy because you're able to answer everything, but you're only able to answer everything because you've been following what's been happening. And I just love doing it. I love it's a real privilege, you know, to be able to have people open up about either the best or the worst parts of their life, and to try and reflect that, and to try and be seen as someone who's fair and who's doing a good job, and trying to highlight women, and making sure that the voices that don't get heard so often are heard, and not me talking for them, but the people talking for themselves. I just love it. Like, you know, I really do enjoy it, and, you know, I'll write and talk and do whatever I can for as long as people want me to.
And it's a good trade for women. It really is a good trade for women. I remember a male psychiatrist at a conference I was at one time saying, you know, what I've noticed about you is you have a problem with male authority figures. And I said, yeah, your point is.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think women who have problems with male authority figures, journalism is a very good trade.
Absolutely.
Profession,
I think that might be our note 10
Yes.
proceedings on.
Yes.
What do you think? Thank you so much to Susan, to Anne, to Fionnuala, to Mary. Thanks to my guests and for everybody who's watching today. And for more, you can visit Amanda.ie.